Hello, welcome to the website. If this is your first time, there's some tabs across the top where you can look at books and music and my blog that I kept during my transplant journey and so forth. I realized that I needed to put some type of video on the website for people who want to know the story but maybe don't like to read or don't want to get the book or whatever. Totally understandable. Because it is a long, windy, twisty story. And I am going to try to tell you that story here as quickly and concisely as possible. I am not usually a very concise person, but I'm actually very what they call verbose. So I'll try to keep it short. It's very tough because there's a lot of things that happened. So again, the details are in the book if you want to get that. There's a companion album that goes with it. The whole thing is called Conversations from Room 1170, and I will just hit the highlights here. So in May of 2016, coming up on now 3 years ago, I underwent a heart transplant at Penn State Hershey Med Center in Pennsylvania, about 30 minutes from where I live now in Lebanon. Contrary to what you may have seen on television, Grey's Anatomy or Chicago Hope or whatever the hospital show is now, showing my age, this was not a quick process. In fact, it was about an 18-year process, and it radically altered my entire life's trajectory. It was not just go in, get a surgery, and go on with life. I liken it to that sensation you get whenever you're driving in a new place and it's very busy and lots of traffic and confusing roads, and your GPS tells you to turn and you can't get over, and there goes your turn. You see the street, but you're passing it. You don't know how to get back, how long it's going to take you to get back. It's just that sinking feeling that you're getting further and further away from where you needed to be, and you're not exactly sure if you're going to be able to get back there. Just imagine that feeling kind of extended over the course of about 18, 19 years. In 1998, so let's go back on the timeline. I was 26 years old. At the time, I was a pastor. I was a musician, a rock drummer, which, as you can imagine, paid zero bills. So my wife and I had actually built a floor and marble servicing business from the ground up, and the business was doing well. We were approaching six figures a year. We were one of the most well-known businesses of our kind in the Little Rock area in Arkansas, where we lived at the time. I was playing in a band called Ground Zero that had just released an album. I was talking to some other bands who were signed to labels about coming on as a drummer. Some of those went on to win Grammy Awards the following year. I had my own band called Dave Johnson's No Man's Band, I think it was called, a pop band, and so I was playing guitar and singing for them. I was leading worship at church, so on and so on. I was so just to paint the picture for you, that I was extremely involved with a lot of different, deeply involved with a lot of different projects, committed to a lot of things, and my life was kind of tied up with a lot of different peoples a lot of people to do these things. As the year went on, I started having trouble doing just basic things, tying my shoes, walking across the room, and certainly playing drums, working, climbing upstairs, those kinds of things. I started to become out of breath really easily. One of the reasons I couldn't tie my shoes, if I bent over, I would start to black out. I had incredible chest pain, and I just remember being so fatigued and so tired all the time. It turns out, after a year of being tested for everything from HIV to stomach cancer and tumors and all this stuff, finally landed with a cardiologist who determined that I had a genetic heart mutation that causes a disease known as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or HCM. You may have heard it referred to as athlete's disease. So what happens is the heart muscle becomes enlarged and stiff, and it can cause sudden cardiac death in some people. I was told, in my case, that I would not live out the year because the disease was progressing so quickly, apparently. This obviously changed a lot of things, as you can imagine. It's just that scenario where you're sitting in the doctor's office and the doctor says you have 6 months to live. So it wasn't quite that dramatic, but that's essentially what happened. I had to cease all strenuous and stressful activities immediately, so that was pretty much my whole life. We sold our business pretty much at a loss. Our finances were in ruins. We were working for ourselves. Our insurance was terrible at that time, and I remember the big shocker was that my main medication cost $800 a month. That was just one medication. So we were shocked by all this because what do you do now? You're working for yourself. We had nothing to really fall back on. We had to move in with my in-laws. They lived about 45 minutes from really where our life was, so that became very complicated to try to continue to be involved in all these things, and I ended up quitting most of them and just kind of sitting in the basement, the finished basement where Christy and I lived at her parents' house, staring out at the pond for about a year, thinking I was going to die at any moment. But here's the thing. HCM, this disease, it's very unpredictable. And we don't know why it does this, but it just turns itself on and turns itself off. A lot of genetic research being done right now to figure out why that is. But for me, it just fortunately stopped progressing. And the problem we had is that there were no specialists in Arkansas at the time, really even in the southern United States. And I can still attest to the fact 19 years later, there aren't really still. I think there's a place in Georgia and a new one in Tennessee, but really no major centers or clinics that are focused completely on treating this disease. A friend advised us of an HCM specialist in Boston, so I flew there with Christy, my wife, in I think this would have been like 2003-ish, and we were told that I, in fact, was not at risk for sudden death, that was a bad diagnosis. And they began to tweak my medications, and I started feeling a lot better and was able to function a little bit better. Certainly not at the level that I had been before. I was diminished, but I went on, for about another decade, 8-9 years or so. Sang in a band, took care of the kids, volunteered at my son's school. So it was, a fairly normal life. I just had to take these medications. Christy, in that time, during that period, I quit being a pastor. She became a nurse. We had some harrowing experiences in ERs where they tried to give me nitro and do this radical rapid diuresing, which would have collapsed my vascular system. So we realized we needed to learn about the disease and educate ourselves so we could advocate, and I could advocate for myself. And we were in a lot of really scary situations where I was being treated by a doctor who knew less about the disease than I did or Christy did. So if you now fast forward to about 2010, probably fall of 2009, spring of 2010, I was 37, I want to say at the time. I started feeling really, really terrible, and I knew that this disease was progressing again. So we took another trip to Boston, and after an MRI, we're told by my doctor there, Dr. Marin, Marty Marin, that I needed a full-blown heart transplant. So again, sitting in the doctor's office, getting the worst news, you can kind of imagine the scenario. This was, again, a shock because HCM is usually, like 99% of the time, it's treated with medications and procedures called ablations or myectomies. So it's really, really rare to need a transplant because of this disease. And because of that, it's very difficult to get listed. There, at the time, were actually no really solid national protocols for putting someone with this disease on a transplant waiting list. That's how rare it was to need it. We're starting to realize that more and more people need transplants for HCM as time goes on. But several cardiologists back in Arkansas, of course, we had to go back home and try to figure out what to do. And we were told there that, I needed a heart. I should be listed, but I didn't meet any criteria for transplant. in terms of the national protocols, and so even trying to get me on the waiting list would just be a waste of time. We were just at a loss as far as what to do sitting in Arkansas. We knew that Tufts in Boston had successfully listed and transplanted several HCM patients, but our support system was there in the South, in Arkansas. So we tried every place that we could think of in Tennessee, Texas, Oklahoma. I went to a hospital in Missouri for about 9 months, back and forth, and it just was not the kind of care that I needed, and they really had no plan for what to do to get me on the waiting list. So again, the disease had kind of stopped progressing, but after the diagnosis of the transplant, but we were told if it starts to progress again, that's probably it. And so we knew we had to make a decision. We didn't want to move away from Arkansas because our support system, our family and friends were there. But if I were going to survive, we had to get somewhere close to Boston. Christy could not get a job there. She tried to, but there was a big graduating class of nurses that year, so the market was kind of flooded, if you want to put it that way. She came up with the idea to take a job with a travel nursing company. So she would employ with this company, and they would contract with hospitals where she would go and work for 3 months and live in a furnished apartment or home somewhere. And she would just do 3 months, then take the next contract. So we decided to do this as a family and travel as a family. And she took assignments close enough to Boston that I could be listed there. We had to be within 4 hours. If a heart shows up, you got to be able to get to the hospital, right? You can't live across the country because the organ's only viable for so long. So for me to maintain my status on the waiting list there for transplant, I had to be within 4 hours. So she started taking these jobs that were about 3 to 4 hours away from Boston. In order to do this, we started homeschooling our two boys, Rich and Brennan. They were 5 and 8 at the time, because we didn't want to pull them in and out of schools every 3 months, obviously. And, they'd already asked these very hard questions, where does the heart come from and what happens when, if Dad doesn't get a heart in time. The big one that was really complicated to talk about was the question, will Dad still love us even when he has a different heart? Because, to a kid's mind, you love somebody with all your heart, this is the seat of all your emotions. They don't really think about the brain being that. They think of it being in the heart. And we were very straight with them in answering these questions. We knew we had a fight in front of us. We were very clear with them that this was going to be a battle and that they were going to be right in there with us. And we didn't really hide anything from them or try to sugarcoat things for them. In the long run, I think that was good, because when we went to make very difficult decisions down the road, as I'll talk about, they were instrumental in helping us to see things from different perspectives that we would not have ever thought of as adults. So we had to go on the road. We had to go and Christy took this job. To do this, we stored our household in, all our furniture in the storage unit, packed what we needed to survive in the back of our Honda Odyssey, which we still drive today. It's got 200 and God knows how many miles on it. But we stuffed in the back of the van. Christy figured out how to, fit all this stuff in there. We had, clothes, some kitchen necessities, of course, the Xbox, my guitar, the boys' Legos, and they each had a bin for themselves that they could put toys and stuffed animals and these kind of things in. And the hope was that we would circle back through Arkansas from time to time, hit the storage unit, and trade out some things as they outgrew clothes and toys and things like that. Over the course of about 2.5-ish, 3 years, this is what we did. We lived on the road in a different place every 3 months, new job, new apartment, new environment. We lived in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and just staying as close as we could to Boston and seeing the doctors there. I got listed there and was being treated at Tufts Medical Center in Boston. We eventually settled in Springfield, Massachusetts, because Christy was offered a job at the hospital there, and it was an hour and a half from Boston, a lot further than we would have liked, but it's so expensive to live in Boston that we just could not do that on a nurse's salary. So we were about an hour and a half away. Figured we'll make this work. She signed a contract, a year-long contract with the hospital. We signed a lease on a house. We settled in, got a dog that we'd promised the boys we'd get once we stopped traveling. My parents got all of our furniture from the storage unit to Christy's parents' house, who her parents then hauled it all the way up to Boston. We moved it in, set up household, and just settled in and thought, this is where we're going to be. This is where the transplant will happen, and we just need to kind of carry on with life as normal as we can possibly make it until that time. So, and I think it's important to understand too, I was in acute heart failure this entire time. I was fighting with debilitating episodes of atrial fibrillation, and I had, angina, which is, these pains that shoot down your left arm. And this was pretty much around the clock. My AFib, as they call it, the atrial fibrillation, where your heart skips out of rhythm, started to become a real problem. I was actually taken to the ER on 5 different occasions and cardioverted, where they, okay, clear, 1, 2, 3, and they shock you, and it puts the heart back into proper rhythm. It's kind of a reset, So that happened about 5 different times at 3 different hospitals during all of this. About 9 months after we had settled there in Springfield and set up household and all this, the Boston team came to us. This would have been Valentine's Day of 2013, and told us that I was not going to make it up the list in time, that I would probably die on the list. And there was not much they could do because there were so many people that needed organs, even worse than I did at the time in that region. There was a shortage of organ donors, and they had a lot of people needing the organs. So huge demand, very small supply. We crunched a bunch of numbers, did a bunch of research, found a doctor actually at Penn State Hershey who dealt with HCM because it ran in his family, and decided, we got to pick up and move there. It's more sparsely populated. We were familiar with the area because we'd been here on assignment. Our first assignment when Christy Travel Nurse was actually here. So picked everything up, it disentangled ourselves from everything there in Springfield, moved to Lebanon here, which is 30 minutes from Hershey. So for the next 2.5 years now, this was summer of 2013 until about the summer of 2015, we were in a schedule, if you will, where I was admitted to the hospital for 2 weeks, and then I would come home for 6, and then go back for 2, come home for 6. We did this for about, I would say, 2 years, maybe a little longer. While I was admitted, I would get what was called a Swan's cath. It's a wire essentially that's inserted into the neck, and they guide it into the left heart cavity so they can monitor what's happening with the heart a little more closely. It also allowed them to give some medications, and helped me accumulate what's called 1A time on the transplant waiting list. And again, I'm trying to keep this video short, and it's so hard to do that. But the details of what that is and why you have to do that, I would have to again say you've got to go read the blog, or you got to go read the book. It's just too much to go into here in a video. But it was very important for me to be in the hospital for those 2 weeks and accumulate waiting time on the list for too many reasons to go into here, and to have this Swan's cath in. These were probably, to me, were the most difficult times, being separated from the family, trying to homeschool the boys, trying not to go crazy, living on an ICU for 2 weeks, because I was conscious. I was up and around, walking around with my little IV pole and the, tubes attached and all this stuff to my neck. We became really close with a couple of other families who, patients. We were called frequent flyers when we're there a lot. You start to know the staff on a first name basis, and you get to know the routine, and they're used to you being there. So it kind of becomes like a second home in a really awful, morbid kind of way. You're surrounded by death all the time because it is a cardiac ICU. So inevitably, while you're there, 3 or 4 people die over the course of those 2 weeks, and hopefully it's not someone you know. But that was the situation for about 2 years. One per kid we became really close to was he was an 18-year-old kid who'd been moved from the children's ward over to the cardiac ICU. His name was Perry, and I've talked about him a lot on Facebook, and he's in the blog and all that, and a lot appears a lot in the book. He's kind of a curmudgeon. He was hard to get to know. He's really grumpy. Of course, in his situation, who wouldn't be? But really soft-hearted guy and smart guy. And we just kind of adopted him, and he kind of adopted us. He became like a big brother to the boys, and Christy kind of became very motherly, mother hen with him in a way. His family lived pretty far away, and it's hard for them to be at the hospital a lot. So we tried to just, as much as we could, be there with him. Whenever I was there, we would cook in his room and watch movies and play games, and a lot of board games and things like that. Even when I wasn't admitted to the hospital, the boys and I would take board games and stop by and buy a bunch of junk food, and we'd go and just spend hours there hanging out with him. So he had almost died from HCM as well, but the docs had intervened and removed his whole heart, and replaced it with what's called a TAW, which is a total artificial heart. It was powered by a pump that he carried around in a backpack, and it was attached to the internal heart by these tubes that were stitched into his abdomen. And that sounds like something you would lay in bed for and just lay there and never move. But he was actually out playing a little bit of basketball with this thing. He could just lap me going around the ICU unit there, and it basically fixed the problem, but you can't live with this thing forever. You don't want to anyway. It ran on batteries. We got used to kind of the thumping and the alarms telling him to change the batteries or plug it in or whatever. But he'd been living with this thing in his chest for 9 months when we met him. And he'd been living there on the HVI for that long. And the big room, he kind of moved into this big room at the end. It's room 1170, which is where the name of the book comes from. It eventually became my room, and you can imagine the conversations that took place in there, not only with our family, but between fellow patients that were living there in the hospital. It kind of became our sanctuary, or kind of where we would congregate. But the story gets really, if it's not crazy enough, it gets really crazy here, because in the spring of 2015, my organs start to fail. My liver and kidneys start to go, because the heart's not, perfusing them in the way that it should. Of course, the doctors then said, well, hey, you've met Perry, right? You've seen the artificial heart. So I knew what was coming, and I was very resistant to the idea of getting one of these things at first. But eventually, through Perry yelling at me and being very belligerent and harassing me, manipulating my kids to make me feel guilty, and a variety of other things, and really, honestly, Brennan, my youngest son, just kind of going through the practicality and of doing it, the pros and cons, and talking to him about that. We talked about it as a family, but he really made a strong case for this being a good idea. And so I did it. We set the date for August, and I made arrangements, for funeral, memorial service, and all in worst case scenario. The surgery went well, though, and I recovered. It took me about 6 weeks, and I went home with this device, to wait for a transplant, to wait to get a real heart. During this time, unfortunately, Perry, he was transplanted, which was we were very excited about at first, but the surgery was very, very difficult for him. It did not go well. He had a bad reaction to the antibodies and the blood transfusions that he was given. There were all kinds of complications. His kidneys failed. So he came out of that surgery in a coma that he stayed in for quite some time. Had to do kidney dialysis, ended up, when he came out of the coma, had to learn to walk again, went to rehab, all of this, and went home. He was home for maybe 6 months, I want to say, probably less than that, maybe like 4 months. So, but started coughing up blood around Christmas. They thought he had pneumonia. It turned out he actually had lymphoma that had sprung up. When after you have a transplant, you take medications, and I do this too, that suppress your immune system. So if there's anything lurking in the body that can take advantage of your immune system kind of being asleep, it will do that. And he developed lymphoma, unfortunately, and died at the age of 19 while we were living there on the same unit when I was actually back in the hospital. So I'm trying not to confuse the timeline. This is, again, you got to read the book. This can be kind of confusing. But I got the TAW. He had the transplant. I went home. He was there in a coma. I eventually, in January of 2016, had to come back into the hospital because the machine was being a little bit wonky and I was having some weird things going on. And it felt safer for me to just stay at the hospital until a heart came. So Perry actually had come back into the hospital after his transplant around Christmas. So I think it was January 31st, he passed away. So that was really hard for all of us because we were looking to him kind of as the hope and the example of someone who could go through this TAW implant and having that taken out, having a heart put in, recovering, and going on with a normal life. So when he passed away, it was, obviously harder for his family than us, but we, especially the boys, it was really, really tough. And I talk about that whole thing a lot in the book. But as life went on for us in May of that year, May 24th, so roughly 5 months after I moved back into the hospital, my donor heart finally came, and in the middle of the night, I was going to bed. I'd been talking to Christy on the phone. It was 2 a.m. My nurse practitioner, Angie, who I love dearly, came in and told me that they had a heart, that it was for me, it wasn't going anywhere else, and the surgeons were out looking at it to make sure it was healthy, and I would be scheduled for surgery later that day. So I went in, had the surgery, did the normal 2 weeks recovery, came home. I think just to speak a little bit to the aftermath of that, I did not go rock climbing and bungee jumping immediately. It was a very hard recovery. I had a lot of swelling in my feet, as most people do. My main problem was that I had quite a bit of rejection on and off. It was not severe. I had one incident of severe rejection where I had to come in the hospital and take huge amounts of steroids and other medications. But I want to say I've been back in the hospital maybe 4 times for a couple of days since the transplant, especially right after it happened, to get IV doses of these medications. But really, I would say for the last year, you continue to have biopsies after this every month and 2 months, something like that, and they start to spread out and get further apart. It was like 2 weeks ago, I had my very last one. Once you have a couple of really good ones in a row, they just release you from care. So that's where I'm at now. I'm really supposed to, according to the doctors, think of myself as a normal person first and a transplant patient second, which is a hard transition to make after being sick for so long. But that's where I'm at now. I'm back playing music, still homeschooling the kids because we enjoy that lifestyle and kind of the freedom that comes with it, the flexibility that comes with it. The boys survived. No one started taking drugs, drinking. Christy and I didn't get divorced. All these horrible, horrible stories that you hear of families going through transplant situation. Fortunately, we, for variety of reasons, I guess, I feel like are closer now than we were when all this was going on. So that's my story. I don't want to prolong it. I can look at the video and see I'm coming up on 30 minutes. So that's about as short as I can make it. Those are all the high points. I've left out probably 80% of the things that happened. So again, if you're interested in that, you can get the book. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those other places. Companion album that goes with it is also available at all those places. You can order it through the links are on the website here under the different tabs. It's called Conversations from Room 1170. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Hopefully that enlightens you a little bit or gives you some kind of context for the conversation whenever I say, well, it's too long to go into. So here I've gone into it a little more than I was probably able to when we spoke. Whoever you are watching this, thank you again. Look for some more videos for me very soon, just talking about some life lessons that we learned along the way, and imparting just incredible wisdom that's going to blow everyone's mind, I'm sure. But I do want to talk about some things that we learned along the way, and some because I know other people are going through situations like this, and it's always good to kind of talk to people who are on the other side of it or hear from them. So I want to try to do that in some future videos. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you later.